He went down in the 39th minute. His teammates gathered around him. He already knew before the doctor said anything. The body has its own language, and that language doesn't lie when it says something broke to stay broken. It was October 2023, in Montevideo. The match was Brazil against Uruguay, and there were 40,000 people watching that man on the ground who was slow to get up. His teammates formed a circle. The doctor ran over. The all-time leading scorer in the history of the Brazilian national team, was crying, and no one knew what to say. Before we go any further, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. And tell us in the comments, which team will you be rooting for at this World Cup? The diagnosis came hours later, a torn anterior cruciate ligament in the left knee. 1 year out. What happened next in Neymar's career is hard to explain. Physical setbacks, multi-million-dollar contracts, crushing international defeats, an unexpected return to his roots, and finally, the chance at redemption, his call-up to the World Cup. To the surprise of many and the joy of so many others, Neymar will play his last World Cup in 2026. But to understand how he got here, his story has to start much earlier. Before he was worth anything to anyone, Neymar was worth everything to one man who had seen him play at 11 years old and decided to reorganize his entire life around that decision. His father, Neymar Sr., had been an amateur player with no professional career. He recognized in his son something he never had, and before the boy was old enough to understand what was happening, a move had already been planned from Mogi das Cruzes to the Baixada Santista. A trial at Santos, the same club that had introduced Pelé to the world. The family had no money. Football wasn't one option among many. It was the only way out the father could see. As he would say years later, "It was the hardest decision I ever made, and the only one I've never regretted." At Santos, Neymar began training with older age groups at 12. By 17, he was already in the first team. Not because the club chose him over several candidates, but because there was something in what he did with the ball that left no other choice. That talent was too big to ignore. Neymar finished his debut season with 14 goals in 48 matches. The following year, in 2010, he became an undisputed starter and the undeniable master of the team. Santos achieved great things during that era and returned to dominate the continent. With him, they conquered the long-awaited Copa Libertadores. The most prestigious trophy on the continent was back in their cabinet, rescuing a dream that had seemed frozen in time. The eternal glory that for decades had seemed reserved only for Pelé's golden generation had finally returned to the club's home. He was named the continent's best player 2 consecutive times before turning 21. The 2011 squad played with a speed and an unpredictability that opposing teams described as impossible to prepare for, not because they had a system, but because they had someone who broke whatever system you put in front of him. His name in São Paulo started being spoken as if it were the name of the club itself. The Santos of Neymar. In 2013, Barcelona paid €88 million. With his departure, Santos's brilliance began to fade. The institution remains great by the echo of its past and by Pelé's eternal legacy, but the current reality is different. Far from continental glory, the team entered a long decline, forced to fight near the bottom of the table, rather than competing for the top of the game. Far from the turbulence of his former club, Neymar shone in Europe. At Barcelona, he lifted the Champions League in 2015 and brought to life an immortal attacking trio alongside Messi and Suarez, playing the most aesthetically beautiful, joyful, and dominant football on the planet. The entire world bowed before a talent that seemed to have no ceiling, a mystique that led him to establish himself as the third best player in the world at the Ballon d'Or ceremonies. Behind the camaraderie and smiles on the pitch, the dressing room harbored a silent tension. Neymar discovered that, no matter how high he soared, there would always be a player that everyone, including himself, recognized as superior. While that established order held, the debate over the world throne would never be his. The breaking point came precisely after his most glorious night. In the historic comeback against Paris Saint-Germain, it was Neymar who carried the team on his shoulders in the final minutes, pulling off a feat that had seemed impossible. But the next day, the iconic photograph that went around the world wasn't his Boomsley and Messi's, lifted on shoulders by the crowd as the one and only Messiah of the Camp Nou. That was where the hunger for the spotlight transformed into urgency. Neymar didn't want to be the heir to an empire, he wanted to build his own. He needed the absolute responsibility of a European giant to prove that his football was no one's satellite, but the center of the footballing universe. In 2016, Barcelona had set his release clause at an astronomical €222 million, assuming the market would never dare cross that threshold. They didn't suspect that one player's pride and will to become the best on the planet were capable of breaking any financial frontier. In the summer of 2017, the unimaginable happened, and the impact shook the foundations of world football. Paris Saint-Germain, backed by Qatari sovereign funds, executed the most audacious transfer in history, paying out the full €222 million of the clause. The market changed forever. Neymar became, by an overwhelming margin, the most expensive signing ever recorded. In Barcelona, the reaction combined disbelief with bitterness. The Culé fanbase felt his departure as an unforgivable betrayal, while the board was exposed by the end of their golden trio. In contrast, the French capital plunged into a state of absolute delirium. The Eiffel Tower was lit up in the Brazilians' colors, and the stands of the Parc des Princes roared at the promise of a new era. The expectation was unanimous. Neymar had come to deliver to Paris the crown they had been longing for, the Champions League. But the weight of those expectations began to erode the project. Neymar's performance in Europe was a reflection of his own duality, flashes of pure genius and insulting technical superiority, cut short by a history of injuries that seemed to target him specifically at the crucial stages of the tournament. The ultimate glory came close in 2020, when he dragged the team to the final in Lisbon, only to fall to Bayern Munich in a stadium emptied by the pandemic. The Brazilians' tears on the pitch sealed the beginning of the disenchantment. In a desperate attempt to reconstruct the oasis of the past, the Parisian club engineered in 2021 a poetic and nostalgic twist: the arrival of Lionel Messi. The Parc des Princes brought together once more the two brightest minds of the modern era, seeking to reignite the magic of the Camp Nou. Yet football proved you cannot replicate the past by force. The accumulation of stars did not translate into a team. It translated into a fractured dressing room under the scrutiny of a relentless press. Instead of continental glory, the final stretch of the alliance was marked by premature exits in the round of 16, jeers from their own supporters, and the certainty that the Paris mega-project had failed. The throne Neymar had sought to build alone turned out to be a gilded cage. While all of that was unfolding in Paris, the Brazilian national team was living its own tragedies. Before his own people, at Brazil 2014, he was the central figure of the team playing on home soil, the favorite for the title. In the quarterfinal against Colombia, Zuniga caught him with a knee to the lumbar spine, a fractured vertebra. The team doctor described the injury as millimetric, 1 centimeter more, and it could have been permanent. Neymar watched the semifinal from a wheelchair in a hotel. On the scoreboard, Brazil were losing 7-1 against Germany, the greatest humiliation in the history of the Brazilian national team, witnessed from a wheelchair by perhaps the only person capable of preventing the catastrophe. Russia 2018 wasn't just a World Cup for Neymar. It was the definitive stage to reclaim the throne that his lucrative move to Paris Saint-Germain demanded of him. He arrived as the planet's absolute superstar, but with an alarming lack of match sharpness after spending the previous 3 months inactive with a metatarsal fracture. The tournament turned into a nightmare of perceptions. Every moment of brilliance on the pitch was buried under the relentless scrutiny of the world's press, which began to caricature his falls and laments on the turf. The number 10 was no longer just fighting against opposing defenders. He was fighting against the weight of his own fame and a global narrative that accused him of play acting. Even so, the talent emerged in the decisive moments. Neymar guided the Canarinha to the quarterfinals, leading the way against Costa Rica and delivering a colossal performance against Mexico. The maturity of Tite's team ran headlong into Belgium's golden generation in Kazan. That afternoon, fate was an insurmountable wall. An early own goal and a devastating Belgian counterattack put Brazil against the ropes. Neymar led the final siege in desperation, searching for the miracle until the last breath. But a legendary save by Thibaut Courtois in stoppage time denied him the goal from the corner that would have forced extra time. The elimination marked a painful turning point. The man who had left for Paris to rule the world was coming home empty-handed, condemned by the critics and with the bitter certainty that European football had taken the measure of his mystique. At Qatar 2022, Neymar arrived at the head of the most complete Brazilian squad of the last 20 years. Fate, however, turned on his body once again. A severe ankle injury in the opening game threatened to extinguish his last great opportunity. But the number 10 endured. He recovered against the clock in a titanic effort and put the armor back on for the quarterfinals, where he conjured something magical in extra time, an extraordinary goal that seemed to seal the passage to the semifinals. Then, fate dressed in chess clothes struck in the final breath. Croatia forced an agonizing equalizer and dragged the match toward the most absolute drama in football, the penalty shootout. There, the Brazilian mystique crumbled. While the Croatians executed with surgical, perfect composure, fear clouded the minds and weighed on the feet of the Brazilians. Goalkeeper Livakovic stopped the first attempt, and the post sent back the last breath of hope. The final image was devastating. Neymar, selected to take the fifth penalty, stood frozen in the middle of the pitch, hands on hips and eyes flooded with tears. He had scored the goal of his life minutes earlier, but the penalty lottery left him out of the World Cup regardless, without even having had the chance to touch the ball one last time. As he would say months later, "The World Cup is the only thing missing from my career, and that weighs on me every single day." After the setbacks suffered both in Europe and with the national team, the dream of winning the World Cup was still alive in Neymar. It was at 31 years old, during a hostile qualifying match, that the star suffered the most devastating injury of his existence, a torn anterior cruciate ligament and meniscus in his left knee. That diagnosis didn't just destroy his season. It represented a surgical blow to the heart of his career, extinguishing the pace and change of gear that made him unique. The body, pushed to the limit for over a decade at the elite level, was sending its cruelest signal at the very moment the number 10 was trying to build his final act. His post-surgery recovery kept him away from the pitch for over a year. When he returned, he discovered the club's management had other plans. The superstar mega project had come to an end. It had failed. Neymar was the face of that project, the mythical number 10, and with the collapse of that era, the renewal began precisely with the closing of his chapter. With no place at the front line of the old continent, the Brazilian's destiny took a sharp turn toward the desert. Al Hilal of Saudi Arabia burst into the market to sign him, spending around 90 million euros, and sealing the most expensive transfer in the history of football outside Europe. The figures in his contract defied the financial logic of sport. Although the popular narrative planted the idea that he would earn the highest salary on the planet, the technical reality was different. His annual income was positioned one step below the historic deals of Cristiano Ronaldo and Kylian Mbappe. Even so, the operation represented a stratospheric outlay that ended up becoming a resounding failure. The severity of his physical condition limited his participation to a handful of meaningless matches. The final balance on Saudi soil was devastating for his contemporary legacy. The club paid an obscene fortune for a footballer who spent most of his time in operating rooms and rehabilitation sessions, recording a desolate statistic: 7 matches played, 1 goal scored, across 17 months under contract. What promised to be a star's redemption ended up being a bitter epilogue. A global footballing giant collecting astronomical figures in a peripheral league, trapped in the labyrinth of his own physical decline. Many thought that was his ending. The bond with Saudi Arabia broke abruptly, opening the door for an idyllic return to Santos. At Vila Belmiro, the home of Santos, the relationship with the supporters and the Brazilian people became a whirlwind of emotions, a mixture of mystical devotion for the idol returning home, and a deep uncertainty about what he still had to offer, with the 2026 World Cup on the horizon. Carlo Ancelotti, the current Brazilian head coach, was quietly watching his most technically gifted players' every move. For months, his name never appeared on a squad list, which planted a nationwide expectation ahead of the final selection. The Brazilian public split into two irreconcilable positions. On one side, his staunch defenders argued emphatically that there was no footballer anywhere in the country with his innate ability to change the outcome of a match in the blink of an eye. On the other, his critics questioned sharply his current technical level, his alarming physical fragility, and the erosion of his public image due to recurring off-field controversies that had cost him the sympathy of a portion of the fan base. The debate came to an end with a decisive blow. Neymar was officially confirmed for the World Cup. To the surprise of many, Ancelotti called him up for the first time in his tenure, a decision accelerated by the tragic injuries to generational figures such as Estevan and Rodrigo, whose absences opened the definitive door for the star. His recent performances back the decision. This year, despite the fact that his total matches played isn't particularly high due to careful load management, his numbers are remarkably solid. 15 matches, 6 goals and 4 assists. He is the team's standout player and captain. On the pitch, he remains a genius with the ball. All of this is the direct result of strict workload management, a daily sacrifice, designed to guarantee his presence at Santos and, of course, to arrive at the big event in one piece. By sealing his place, he becomes one of the few footballers in history to compete at 4 World Cups. The appetite and competitive fire remain intact, and the number 10 shirt belongs to him by the weight of history. Stripping him of it would have been a direct blow to his legacy, especially because there is no player in the current squad with the absolute standing to claim that legendary shirt number. A starting place is no longer an undisputed certainty. The widespread skepticism about his physical condition raises an enormous question mark over whether the star will be able to compete on equal terms from the first minute against the intensity of the world's powers, or whether his body will hold up through the tournament without breaking down again. But beyond the doubts, one truth remains unalterable. Alongside Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo, Neymar stands as one of the greatest stars of the competition. His mere presence on the substitutes bench exercises an intimidating magnetism over any opponent. The certainty is absolute when the illuminated board flashes on the touchline and the number 10 prepares to step onto the pitch. Reverential fear will take hold of the opposition. The physical doubts don't matter, nor does the past. The enemy's tactical board will light up with alarms. Neymar is coming. The World Cup starts in June. Neymar arrives with the national team's all-time scoring record, without the title that would make his career undeniable, with a body that Ancelotti considered fit enough to be on the list, with a career that, between 2 torn ligaments, 3 World Cups, and €222 million, never settled the account that mattered most. The window is open. There is no other World Cup after this one. This is the last chance for fate to decide whether Neymar's final act will be written in glory or in frustration. And would Neymar make it into your national team? Subscribe to the channel and leave your opinion in the comments. I want to know what you think about the confirmed presence of the Brazilian star.